Welcome, folks. I'm Eddie Carson, and you are listening to Race Matters. I'm looking forward to welcoming my guests here to the fold as we kind of delve into the usual things that we get into when we think about the nomenclature of race, class, gender, culture, and all those other elements that are necessary as we continue to look at the progress of society, but also the ways in which we think about race and that human capacity that is there. Folks, we have here Professor Jeff Baker, who is the Associate Dean of Clinical Education and Global Programming at the Pepperdine University School of Law. Jeff is a prolific scholar with just a fascinating CV. He's written countless articles. He has um, uh, published a number of papers, books, and I guess just to make sure I get the legal arguments and stuff right, because I'm no law person whatsoever. You you're not writing briefs per se, like in a type of expansive capacity, because those briefs are only for like the courtroom, but not for journals.
I write sort of everything, my friend.
Everything.
And my principal job at the law school is to run, and in legal education is to run our legal clinics.
Mhm.
And so legal clinics are a teaching law practice inside the law school. So I have a clinic myself, and we have several different clinics, including at least two appellate clinics which do write a lot of briefs, and I get to provide my opinions, but I don't write them anymore. Not these days.
Well, no, and that's something I know. I was reading and looking at your bio, and I noted a couple things here and everything too. That your scholarship focuses on things dealing with issues of human rights, social justice. You already pointed out your work in legal education, ethics, and the intersections of law, theology, and jurisprudence, and also public policy along the way. And you're living out there in Pepperdine, California, at Pepperdine University, which is in Malibu, California. And of course, you made your sojourn out to Pepperdine from my hometown of Montgomery, Alabama. Oh.
Right. You and I share many things, and your audience will soon learn, or will now learn, that you and I have known each other for just about 30 years, even though we look super young. And we're both from Alabama, both went to Harding University in Little Searcy, Arkansas, and you made your way to New England, and I made my way to California.
And of course, the biggest difference there, of course, is the temperature difference. And the
Right.
fact that I look at mountains and snow and you are on a
I look at
campus.
mountains in the ocean.
Well, and everyone has seen some of those classic pictures of the beach and the water and the ocean and all that. And I've never been to Malibu before. I've never been to Malibu. I've not been on the campus of Pepperdine University. And I feel like I'm one of the last few souls who has
Well,
a connection within this world we operate in that has yet to get to Pepperdine.
Well, we need to fix that. And let me say, I didn't have New England roots. We're addressing folks in Massachusetts and Vermont and New England, but until recently, when my daughter has started at the University of Maine, and so now she is a black bear, and we love hockey, and we are learning our way around New England. So it
Well,
is my pleasure to be able to address some New England friends tonight too.
you should know that I sit down and I calculated how far I am from Orono, Maine, where the flagship campus of the University of Maine is located. And oh, it was just farther than I realized. I think it's about 4 hours from me, a little over 4 hours. And I was thinking it was going to be a little closer than that. So,
Maine is way up there, and this summer we had our drive from Malibu to Orono, 3,181 miles, and the last stretch through Canada because it was a shortcut, and we got to see this whole grand country from corner to corner, and did a lot of reflection along the way as we rolled across those miles.
oh, that makes sense. Well, Jeff, Professor Baker, Welcome to Race Matters. And one of the things that I want us to get into and I want us to delve into a little bit, particularly as it relates to you and your work and you as a human being and everything too, is you are quite the prophetic white ally, someone who's leaned quite a bit into social justice and everything. But it's interesting, and the question I'm curious about is that while you're this progressive anti-racist, I won't speak for the race part, but the progressive part, that hasn't always been your MO for a long period of time. I mean, for a period of your life, you would define yourself as being much more conservative, particularly coming out of the state of Mississippi. I can't remember what part of it is it Jackson?
No, I grew up in Columbus, Mississippi,
Columbus.
and graduated from Columbus High School, and which would had formerly been, for the sake of all my friends who might be listening, SD Lee High School, the SD Lee Generals, by the way, which could be part of the story. From in Columbus, and then went to Harding, where you and I went to college together and met. Sure. I grew up in a very typical, very common environment that was steeped in what we would now consider evangelical Christianity. My church that I grew up in, and the tradition that I still have roots in, is the Churches of Christ, which there's a whole complicated story we could tell about that. But it is essentially theologically conservative, essentially politically conservative in the way that I grew up. And also in my family, sort of low key Confederate apologist, which is not uncommon in the South, where I have great grandfathers who were both Confederate soldiers back in the day, and were surrounded in this milieu of one growing up right in this place. And so when you and I met in college, Harding is a pretty politically aligned school with right-leaning conservative roots. And I want to, in this conversation, be careful to define the difference between conservative and Republican, just like I would be conscious of just finding the difference between liberals and Democrats, too. But Harding was a pretty conservative school, and in these lines, and I was very much in that mode when you and I met. I mean, it was my home. I went there on purpose. Um, and along the way, which is we can talk about this some more, but along the way, it was a combination of faith and church life and the things that I was learning about faith and about Christian teaching about love and justice, and the Gospels, combined with some very patient and wonderful teachers that you and I both had. In fact, recently you had our professor, Dr. Mark Elrod, on this show, who helped spark some changes in me, and my sort of faith journey coincided with a political evolution in my life. But honestly, I'm 49 now, and that was literally 30 years ago. So I've been on that trajectory for a while. But yeah, it came up out of those roots, and surrounded by people who are full of love and full of compassion for the world, but who hold on to more conservative politics and conservative theologies, and having to wrestle with that a little bit.
So Jeff, as we think about really your own trajectory and the direction that you've kind of navigated in and everything too, what road bumps or challenges have you encountered? And particularly thinking about, your background when it comes to faith and spirituality, for example, and really understanding the political ideological landscape of your background, your past, but thinking about your present and the future direction you're moving into, especially as that connects to your work as a legal scholar.
Sure. It's an interesting tension sometimes. And as a young person, I remember sitting and listening to sermons about how we ought to love everyone. And we grew up singing a song, red and yellow, black and white, they are precious in his sight. And, a lot, that's some problematic language we would acknowledge now, but nonetheless, that was the ethos we were in. But then seeing a very serious disconnect between the lived reality and what I was being told and what we were learning about. And I mean to say, like, I went to a predominantly white church or almost an exclusively white church, and I was in a city that was about 50-50 black and white. And I went to a predominantly black high school, and I was hearing, like, love everybody, love your neighbor. And then I was seeing in practice, even in the 1990s, a real de facto segregation, right? And real privilege and real corruption in these thoughts, and a real tension and incongruity between what I was reading in the Bible and hearing in church, and the lived experience of what was essentially still a segregated society. Just a little history here. Brown versus Board of Education was 1954, integrating public schools in the United States. Brown versus Board of Education 2 was in 1955, and that's where the Supreme Court said that states should integrate schools with, quote, all deliberate speed.
Mhm.
All deliberate speed in Mississippi meant that schools were finally legally integrated in 1971. Um, and then I started high school in 1990. So, I mean, I'm solid Gen X post civil rights movement child of boomers. And I was still in the first generation and a half or so after integration, legal integration in Mississippi. And so we were all sort of struggling with that. I had, this is going to sound horrible and cliche. I mean, like, I had a lot of black friends. Like, we were all in proximity with each other. And this is something that I think some parts of the rest of the country don't really quite
Well,
understand. Is that in the
and
South,
yeah, and
we're
that's
in
it. That's just the South in general.
we're in
It's
proximity
segregated.
to each other. And
Yes.
so the challenge of going to a predominantly black public high school with my beloved friends, and then going to church, which was absolutely segregated, but saying that we needed to be full of love for all people, was a real dissonance. And I'm not even, I mean, I'm talking about my specific church, but I mean, that is an extremely common, perhaps universal experience across most of the South, at least in most of the 20th century. And so, growing out of that and challenging that was pretty important. And I want to be careful today and not try to be the hero of my own story. I mean, we're all walking these paths together. But at some point, in late high school or early college, I looked around and said to myself, I didn't say it out loud. I was like, said to myself, now I want to be on the right side of these issues. I want to be on the side that favors justice and love. But for me, not as an escape from my faith background, but because, as an expression of my faith background, saying I want to be on the correct side of these
Mhm.
arguments, especially on race and racism, segregation, racial justice. I was developing a vocabulary around that. But even then, I could look around and say, like, well, the people who appear to be manifesting truth and justice in these conversations are Martin Luther King Jr., uh, Lyndon Johnson. I mean, like, the people who were pushing forward on racial justice were the progressives. And so that was a huge pull for me at that formative time as a political science major and a ministry major, learning much more deeply about the gospel and what Christian uh, teachings are on justice and love, and then also learning about politics and law along the way. So that was sort of the roots of that. And um, I mean, I'll tell this quick story. I don't know if you remember this, but I went to college and I hung a Confederate battle flag on my wall in my dorm. Uh,
No, I did not know this.
well, so I say this confessionally now, but I put up a big Confederate battle flag on my wall because I was just a white boy from Mississippi, and it was mostly like team spirit, right? I had 15, 16, 17 years old, like, taken in that whole heritage, not hate heresy, and believed there wasn't anything wrong with this. It was dispute around the Constitution or whatever. And it was just essentially like Southern pride. Like, I'm proud of my place and I'm proud of my people. I'm not a white supremacist. I mean, I wouldn't have said that. I would have said that the Klan was evil. I would have said all those correct things, but I would, like, they're not going to co-opt my symbol. So I hung this flag up. And in fact, when I took Civil War history with Paul
Oh,
Haney,
Haney.
I used to he divided us up into northern and southern armies, and I actually would take it in on my exam days and like lay it across my desk and take my finals. Now I say all that confessionally because I got to a point where I became convicted as a matter of faith that that was just wrong, that it was unchristian. To fly that flag was a vile affront to people who I loved, and that I needed to take it down. And I remember there was a black guy who was in our dorm at RA, and I said to him, "Man, what do you think about this?" And he said, I hate that flag, but I trust you." And that night I took it down,
Good,
and
good for you.
never hung it up again, and put it away. And I know that this is fraught and complicated, but essentially it came down to this: is this thing that I'm doing harming someone else I love? And it was, and so I felt even at that young age, teenage years, the conviction to renounce it, to denounce it, to take it down and put it away. And that was a germinal part of my journey at Harding, out of sort of the the dirt that I grew up in.
So, a couple things you said there, and I'm intrigued. And that Confederate flag story is interesting. I'll never forget the first time I went into Professor Paul Haney's office. He had this big Confederate flag hanging in his office, and I remember saying, "Don't you think there's a problem with that?" And he had that deep voice, right? And he said, "This is about." And he's a big Civil War person and all of this stuff. And he went on to give me this lecture in his office about how this is just predicated on culture and heritage and all of those things that were there. And I remember just rolling my eyes. And I told him this. I said, I will never come back to your office again. And,
Right.
I had him in multiple classes, but I'll never come back to your office again. Not with that thing, flying or being there. And when we think about these issues here, you're kind of in an interesting person. You're this, you're this pronounced legal scholar, this intellectual, this thinker, but you're someone who also thinks about or operates within a realm of faith. And so I'm going to put you on the spot here because that's just what I do. It's my show, and I'm going to do whatever I want to do. So here's my question for you. You have this dichotomy that you're in, and you have to make decisions based off justice work, whether it really falls down to the biblical realm of doing justice work or the legal realm of doing justice work. And you got to pick. You can't ride the fence. Which one do you take? Which side do you lean toward?
Proper law professor answer. It depends.
That's fine. I'll take that.
But I'm gonna answer your smart question. I actually believe that we sometimes draw those lines too harshly. But I will say this: I don't think those things have to be. I understand that we could come up with a scenario where that would be pretty tense. But there's this. I'm a lawyer. I'm a lawyer in 3 states, a member of the bar of 3 states, and I've taken an oath to support the Constitution, 3 different times, and in multiple ways before multiple courts. And so I believe that that is something that I have said, and I'm going to hold myself to it. So, I mean, I believe expressing that is an expression of my faith. I mean, that's an expression of integrity and like sticking to my oath. So I have sworn in an oath to defend and support the Constitution. And so I think that's important. But now here's a distinction I want to draw, and it's actually something I've been writing and wrestling with quite a lot. How to be a person of faith, um, or let's just say a person of conviction, but in this case, a person of faith in a democracy, a republic where we also have to be very rigorously vigilant about the dangers of religious nationalism, about theocracy, and about the coercive power of law. Because law is coercive. I mean, we are making people do things or not do things. I mean, it's the way we order our society, right? And in a democracy, a pluralistic secular democracy, which is the United States of America, We have the duty and the sort of civic obligation to express our own convictions and our own faith and vote in the way, proceed in the way that we think that the law ought to go, and also not impose that on anyone else through the law. And so that tension, I think, especially right now in sort of our polarized life, can become somewhat lost because there are some people who will say, "I'm Christian. This ought to be a Christian nation. I'm going to make this be a Christian nation." I I will say that there is nothing Christian about such an argument. There is nothing properly Christian or biblical about someone saying that they want to impose their faith on the rest of the country. That's not only un-American, it's also, in my opinion, not biblical. And on the other hand, we each have the calling, the right, the privilege, the duty to infuse our advocacy, our voting, our engagement from a place of faith, right? And so I boil this all down to the golden rule, which sometimes we just think is a bumper sticker or a crocheted pillow or something. I actually think this is one of the most radical things in the Bible. Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount, talking about love, the Beatitudes, etc., ends toward the end with saying, and do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Later on in Matthew, he says, the two greatest commands are to love God and to love your neighbor as yourself. And that to me, that reflective moral ethical principle, almost like this Kantian impulse of saying this is how everything ought to order itself, is that if I would not have someone dominate me, then I cannot dominate someone else. Abraham Lincoln said apocryphally, if I would not be a slave, so I will not be a master. And so I would say, if I'm not comfortable with someone imposing their religion on me, then it is a part of my faith to not try to impose my faith on them, right? And if I would not go to prison for something that is, unjust, I should not put someone else in prison. If I would not be judged on my race to get a home loan, then I should make sure that someone else is not getting. You see how that goes? And so I think if I would not want to sit in a public school room and have some other religion's prayer being prayed over me, then it is my Christian responsibility to not impose a Christian prayer on other people too. And so I think that is a way that Christianity can express itself correctly in a democracy, in a plural democracy. And so to that end, I like to think that there's not going to be the tension that you just described, because if everybody is coming into the situation with love and a sense of dignity for every other person in the room, then that ought to balance those scales just a little bit.
That was wonderful. That was well put. I appreciate that, brother. Folks, if you're just jumping in and joining us here, this is Eddie Carson. This is Race Matters, and I have here joining us Professor Jeff Baker out of Pepperdine University School of Law. I'm excited to have him here on WJOP, Joppa Radio 96.3, Newburyport, Massachusetts. One of the things you talked about just now is this idea of having different faiths imposed and placed on other folks. And yet, within this political climate that you alluded to earlier, we see certain things happening. The two big examples, and I think I'm going to get this correct, and I know you'll correct me if I'm wrong. In the state of Oklahoma, they're now demanding that Bible be taught in public schools, right? And again, I am all for teaching religion, particularly when you look at different aspects, but we're talking about biblical Christianity. In the state of Louisiana, I believe it's been proclamated that the Ten Commandments should preside over public institutions and public schools. Can you speak to that a little bit, particularly in terms of what you just referenced and thinking about the role of faith and Christianity in that of the law?
Right. Two thoughts. But first, let me also say, I believe that the superintendent of education in Oklahoma went to Harding. So,
Yes, it's interesting, and I meant to drop
so
that
we're
in.
having this conversation with it's a complicated place. So I have two thoughts on this. One is first, uh, the Constitution of the United States it begins with this phrase, "We the people." That is a pretty radical Enlightenment statement. It is saying that the sovereignty of the nation arises from the people, not from God, not from some divine ordination. The radical opening lines of the Constitution are this fundamental humanist secular notion that the sovereignty of the government arises from we the people. It's not a throwaway line. It's actually serious political theory. Then we know later on that there is the First Amendment, and the First Amendment says that Congress shall make no law establishing any religion, including Christianity. And so the country then, less so now, was culturally dominated by Christianity, but the founders were, and this is just not even a close call, the founders were explicitly and expressly secular. They may have had their own faith, but they very specifically, all of them signed on to a secular government. It is just right there in black and white. There may have been a Christian culture, but it is a secular government on its face. And so uh, we cannot have in this country the established religion of any religion. Now, that's part one. Part two of my answer is this. As I understand the position from the other side, the examples that you just gave in Oklahoma and Louisiana, there is an attempt at an argument that that Western law arises from the Bible. And then therefore we can do this, we can teach the Bible and establish the Ten Commandments as the root of Western law and try to get away with it. Like to mandate the teaching of these documents in such a way that isn't religious, but we look at it, if it walks like a duck, quacks like a duck, it's a duck. Like this is teaching Christianity. There's just no way around it. And that is just unconstitutional. And also that second argument, that's just wrong.
Yeah.
It is just wrong. I mean, the Bible and Christianity have been an influence, but we are not reading the Code of Justinian. We are not looking at Roman law. We are not talking about, except in Louisiana, French Napoleonic law. You are not mandating, they are not mandating the obligation to read Aristotle, to read Plato, to read John Locke. I mean, that is just a specious argument. It just falls apart. And there may be judges and courts out there that are gonna accept it. But in my opinion, as a Christian and as a lawyer and as an American, it just doesn't hold any water. And I would like to see, and I think there's a curious political turn here. Why are we posting the Ten Commandments? Which, I mean, let's talk about that religiously, theologically all day long. We can talk about the Decalogue. We can talk about what it meant in the Hebrew scriptures and the New Testament. We can talk about that. But why aren't we posting the Beatitudes on the wall? Why aren't we saying, blessed are the poor, blessed are the peacemakers, blessed are the poor in spirit? Matthew 25 says, visit the prisoners, welcome the strangers, feed the hungry. They say, have all your property in common. Those are all biblical precepts, and the picking and choosing of what that means in Christian nationalism is just problematic constitutionally, and it's problematic theologically
Well,
too.
and you just alluded to this because really this boils down to part of this larger cultural war that's taking place. And really, we're going to we're going to try to define things. It's been going on for a long time. I think back to, when I was in high school, don't ask, don't tell, as part of that. Really, and actually then that was really pushed, I believe, by the Democrats.
Was Bill Clinton's policies, right?
Yeah, in terms of negotiating with Republicans. Then you got DOMA, the Defense of Marriage Act. The 2004 election, for example, became a referendum on same-sex marriage. And then, of course, now we're still seeing some of these same attitudes that relate to folks who identify as transgender, right? So it kind of goes on and on and on in terms of how we think about these things. But yet, one of the things that you stated is something that I'm not sure a lot of people fully understand, and that is this notion of Christian nationalism. Jeff, what is Christian nationalism? And what are your concerns? I'm making an assumption here, but I think I know you well enough to know that you have a lot of concerns
Right.
about Christian nationalism.
Sure. Well, I would say nationalism, Christian nationalism, is the idea that this ought to be a Christian nation explicitly, not just culturally, but politically and legally too, an expression of Christian identity. And that there and by the way, an extraordinarily narrow version of Christianity, by the way. I mean, like this is not capturing the great vast diversities across all of Christian articulations. But it's the idea that this country ought to impose Christian identity. It also elevates, in my opinion, Christian nationalism or any kind of nationalism, elevates the nation state above a political entity into a religious entity. This is
Theocracy,
Iran, for
essentially.
instance, right? Any theocracy, Iran, I would say, Israel has an expressly religious identity. That is an attempt to make the United States of America identified with one particular faith. But here's the real danger, and you asked me what my concern is. This is the real danger. I let me first say, like, I believe every Christian ought to have every person ought to have a full voice in the government, right? I mean, that's what a pluralistic democracy ought to be. That's James Madison's vision, is that everyone from across the great spectra of humanity has a voice in the government, and that creates something stable and strong that moves towards justice. The problem with nationalism is that it elevates one voice over all other voices and then makes it unassailable. It makes it a it makes it blasphemous to criticize the government because it is then an expression of someone's church and someone's God. I think Christian nationalism, from my Christian point of view, is just straight up idolatry. I mean, it is elevating the nation to a place where you have to be subservient to authority that you cannot critique because it has some divine right to rule, some mandate from heaven. And that is just not constitutional. It's not how America works. And to impose that vision means that you are actually denying not only the Constitution, but also faith. For this point, Jesus ignored and had and rejected empire. I mean, the Jesus movement of the first century was anti-empirical. They weren't trying to bring down Rome, but they weren't trying to become Rome either. Jesus says in one famous story about taxes, "Give unto Caesar what is Caesar's, give unto render unto God what is God's." We sometimes don't really understand exactly what that means, but he's actually diminishing the emperor when he says that, because the Roman mindset was that the state is everything and the emperor is everything. And Jesus says, well, you can give him what's his, but not the rest of everything else. And so to claim that the United States is a Christian nation to impose Christian identity is actually not Christian at all. It is certainly not constitutional. And originalism is having its moment right now, but nothing about this would have appealed to Washington, Adams, Jefferson, oh good Lord, he would have hated it. Hamilton, all of those founders would have said that is antithetical to what they were trying to build.
So then essentially what you're saying here is we're at a in this trajectory, this narrative called the United States of America has definitely taken a turn, but it's not the first time, right? We've seen this
No,
where we have again society, culture, the law, faith, and the ways in which people try to dictate the direction we're moving in, whether it's not, going back to the Scopes monkey trial, right? We think about some of
sure.
those things that are there too. But yet something does feel, and I'm not trying to be an alarmist here, but something feels puzzling, scary, particularly when we think about the way the law works, the way faith works within society, especially the way those things coalesce around whiteness in this country in the 21st century. And again, I'm not being alarmist, but there feels like there's something there where the identity of whiteness is really trying to hold on to a claim out of fear of queer people, Black and brown folks, immigrants to the country, and things that feel antithetical to what it means to be an American.
I think, I mean, there's nothing new under the sun. It's certainly not the first time, but I think what is different now is the scale of the change that you just described. I have kids in college. Gen Z is probably the first generation that is very closely, if it hasn't already tipped over to be the generation in the United States that has more people of color than white non-Hispanic people. White non-Hispanic people probably have the plurality still, but not the majority. And and we were talking about proximity just a little bit. We don't have in the country anymore de facto de jure segregation. Like we don't have segregation by law. We have racially neutral laws. We are still very, very segregated by and large, right? I mean, just culturally, geographically. I just said we just drove across the country, right? I mean, I live in probably the most diverse county in the country, Los Angeles County, 10 million people. 1 million of those 10 million people are undocumented immigrants. There are 180 languages spoken in this county. And there's a different way of talking about immigration and race. And LA is not, doesn't have it all together. But I mean, but there's a different sort of proximity there. But if you drive across this country, um, people can exist, most people exist in their communities, and they hear these things and they get a sense that something is changing. And change can be scary, right? And I don't think that most people walking around, I don't think most, I'm about to share some benevolent assumptions. I don't think most white people walking around are like, I don't like black people, I don't like gay people. I hope that's true. But most people don't have proximity to all the people that you were just talking about, trans people, immigrants, undocumented people. And when they do come into proximity to those people, there can be love and transformation and engagement, right? But the fear that has, and I think this is a political tactic, the fear that runs through the country on these issues comes from people, politicians and others who are afraid of losing power. That's actually the punchline of what I'm trying to say. The retrenchment, the reactionary, legal political things that we're talking about are, in my opinion, because those folks feel like they're losing ground socially and culturally, and they are. Socially, culturally, the country's not going back. I don't mean to co-opt a political phrase. Because we just don't usually go back. But it is not impossible to believe that people could be very aggressive in taking political power and legal power to retrench their minority position. And I actually think that's what's happening right now. I'm out of law professor mode into political mode, but I think that what you're talking about is an attempt to hold on to the reins of power and this is what Christian nationalism can be too, a form of being able to force oneself on the rest of the country while they see demographically we're just not going back. Like you can't put that back in the bottle. Like the demographics of Gen Z and Gen A and everybody else who's going to come after them are not going to change. It's a much more diverse world. They have no concerns about queer. I shouldn't say no. The concerns about queer identity just don't register with them in the same way that it registered with our generation. I'm not saying every gay kid is safe. I'm just saying there's a different cultural mentality about that. And I think that those kids just don't want to cotton to those old biases as much anymore. And so the people who see that coming are stoking this fear, stoking this anger, and then trying to get their hands on the political handles of power in order to slow that down and stop it.
I mean, that's interesting too, because, oftentimes I tell folks, as I've spent most of my lifetime in the 20th century, that a lot of the things in the 20th century need to stay in the 20th century, but it seems like folks who operated within the 20th century, who continue to navigate forward in the 21st century, are really pulling the 21st, or excuse me, the 20th century into the 21st century and just trying to
Right.
like hold a place that's there. And I always like to think about that because I mean it's like a lot of things too. When we think about society, culture, the law, all of those things, they're just they're problematic things that I we should just shut the door on the 20th century. And we can go through the list of crimes there that are
Yeah.
problematic. Um, you know, Professor Baker, as we get to a end here at Race Matters, I'm Eddie Carson, and you're listening to Race Matters here at WJOP 96.3 Joppa Radio. I always like to give my guests the last word. And what I like to do is I want to give you the last word. And here's my question for you. What is your hope? What is your desire for the present and for the future? As someone who has kids, you're a legal scholar, you're a teacher, you're engaged in these things, you're engaged in activist community work. What is your hope?
My hope comes from this. And I do have hope, quite a lot of hope, actually. I'm sort of compulsively optimistic. It's a defense mechanism, and maybe a privilege, but nonetheless, I used to sort of long for, like I think most people at a certain age in their life long for a revolution. Like we have to change this whole thing. We need to burn it down. We got to start over. We can do better than everybody else has come before us. I think that's naive. I think it's not realistic. I think that's not part of the world. But the real satisfaction that I have come to embrace is that every generation we have to take our shift. We have to take our turn. And across all of humanity, there have always been people holding on to the torch, holding on to the light, despite the corruption around them, despite the bad governments, despite the bad churches, despite all of the abuses. There have been people who have fought for love and fought for justice, fought for human dignity to push us forward, to learn, to be curious, to be free. And it comes down to every generation to receive that, to steward it and protect it for a season, and then hand it off to the next generation. And sustainable and sturdy change and progress only really ever comes incrementally. And sometimes that's not satisfactory to the young revolutionary, but to see and to appreciate sturdy incremental progress, and then the fight to protect that progress gives me hope. And honestly, I love my kids, but I teach young people. So do you. I have daughters who are doing extraordinary things and have big dreams, and I love them. I actually think this generation, they have fought through some stuff that honestly, this most generations don't get to say this, but they went through COVID, which is an extraordinary thing. But even more in America, these kids have gone through school shootings and school shooting drills, sort of the age of disruptive, reactionary politics and January 6th. They've seen some stuff, and I think that's going to affect them. And I think that it's going to affect how they see the world. And so I sort of take hope right now from the fact that we can, you and I can, and our fellow travelers can hold on to light and love and justice and try to teach and equip them to be able to take it on forward. I'm always optimistic because I don't know. There's a quote from I think Seward in the Civil War. I'm gonna get it wrong, but I think Seward said to Lincoln or Grant, "The Republic will always have enough virtue, but sometimes just enough." And
Mm.
I think we're in one of those moments right now where we are going to see that we have just enough. But we're in a moment right now where really the best we can hope to do is to hold on to the light so that the next generation can push it forward. So that's where I get hope.
Folks, this is Race Matters. Thank you for tuning in. I'm here with Professor Jeff Baker. Thank you for chiming in. Until next time.